Thank you all. Is this on?
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, of course, in conversation with Molly, as it's always a pleasure to be in conversation with Molly, and then also here at the Jaipur Literary Festival, which is really one of the best literary festivals in the world, and it's such a pleasure to participate in this one in New York. So, you know, the last time well, first of all, I would recommend to those who have not, please read Molly's memoir. It's unlike anything that I've ever read, and truly an inspiration for young women, young people everywhere. So please do. It's called Drawing Blood. It's beautiful. So the last time Molly and I met was just earlier this summer. I was sitting for you and trying to be still enough for Molly to draw, while at the same time trying to see how you draw. Your gestures, the focus, the intensity of your gaze in making all of this painterly magic that's in evidence in all your work. So let's just begin with that. How is it that you decide what to paint? What inspires you? What draws you to draw? And how is it that, I mean, it seems to me that there's something quite singular about your vision, even in having made a decision to paint or to draw, you see something that's not visible otherwise. And it seems often to be a political act.
Okay, all right. So thank you so much, Nermeen, for that generous introduction and for being my model. And thank you so much to Jaipur Literary Festival. At this point, I've spoken at Jaipur events in Denver and also in magnificent Jaipur itself. And I love this literature festival more than any in the world. It is the finest that exists. So thank you so much for having me as a repeat guest. Now, the question of, I guess, like, why I draw what I draw. So I have always been attracted to the extremes of life. Now, what does that mean? It could mean a beautiful burlesque dancer who is eating fire at a downtown club at 3 a.m. Or it could mean a war zone where people are trying to defiantly continue their lives while Russian bombs go off around them. Now, why do I do such an archaic method, right? A sketchbook. I mean, we live in a time of omnipresent digital images where every single person has a camera phone, where there are now even these really revolting AI generators that are making sort of human centipede facsimiles of art. So why do I draw? And I suppose it's because, for me, what drawing is it's the best, most complicated. I knew it wasn't on. So why do I make pictures as opposed to any of the other ways that we could convey images in this overly technologized world we have? And the reason is that for me to draw, it's like the most intense way to see. Every time you look at something, it contains an infinity. Like, I could look at your face, Sarah, right over there, and I could look at the gaze in your eyes, I could look at the slant of your smile, I could look at your hair, I could look at how your shoulders are, I could look at the different colors in your skin and how light and shadow falls in it. I could see like a whole world in your face, right? And what drawing does, sorry to make you uncomfortable, but it's true, I could. And what drawing does is it gives me permission to do that. It gives me permission to really, really look. And to really look, that's something that a lot of women don't get the permission to do, right? When I was growing up, I'm from New York City, to really, really look at someone on the subway was an invitation to them hitting on me or maybe them fighting me. At the very least, them asking me for money. It was not something that I was necessarily allowed to do or I would get off scot-free for. And so what drawing was my permission slip, right? It was how I could see the infinity and richness of reality, starting with the marvelous city I was born in. It's what let me look.
And then in the looking, though, as you said, giving this gentleman as an example, you see, of course, what, I'm looking at him and I see. But then you're also, in the sketches in the drawings in this book, and then in your subsequent, more overtly political writing, the book on Syria, for which we had you on, Democracy Now, the book on Syria, and also your pieces in the New York Review of Books on Ukraine and Palestine. There's something in what you capture in expressions on people's faces, which, if I were to see, sorry to make you the center of this conversation, if I would not see, I would not be able to convey in words what you could convey in your drawing him. What is that vision?
I think what it is, and again, sometimes it's hard to explain because my native language is drawing rather than writing. Every person, right, they contain both an infinity, but that infinity is only visible through, their face, their carriage, their way of walking, their smile, their clothing. And I think that what's political about how I draw people is that I often draw people on the margins of life. For instance, people who are seeking asylum, people in Gaza who are trying to rebuild a hospital that Israel has bombed, people who are in a refugee camp in Greece, people who are South Asian construction workers in Abu Dhabi whose labor is creating these great museums and who are getting paid $150 a month. I draw people like that who are not usually permitted to contain multitude. They're not usually permitted to contain universes within themselves. At best, when they're portrayed at all, they are portrayed as flat stereotypes, either as objects of sympathy or as objects of fear. And I've always thought that both of these things, the object of pity and the object of fear, these are just flat cliches, and the antithesis of a cliche, the way that you kill a cliche is you really look, right? It's that time, that sort of astuteness of perception that kills the cliche.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this. When did that recognition come to you, that in seeing, in drawing, you can give to a person, a place, these multitudes that would not otherwise be granted it? In other words, simply in the act of drawing, you were making a political gesture.
I think it came to me when I was 17, and I had the immense good luck that I was able to graduate high school early and spend 6 months running around Europe on very, very little money, but nonetheless 6 months alone running around Europe and Morocco. And when I was in Morocco, I had never been to an Arabic-speaking country before. I'd never been to a Muslim country before. I had a lot of stupid preconceptions, as many Americans do. And when I went there and I saw these amazing cities and how cool people were, and I saw punk girls with feminist bookstores, and I saw old men that could do things with paint that I had never seen in my life, and I wanted to capture that, and I think I wanted to get down in my sketch pad the impossible complexity and beauty and muchness that I saw in front of me that was so counter to my sort of cliched idiocy that I was fed as a typical American kid.
Uh-huh. And then you saw, it seems from your book and then the work that appeared subsequently and continues to, that you saw greater and greater potential in doing that kind of work. I just want to read a short quote from this book in which you write, quote, "Though I was the daughter of an artist and a Marxist, I'd always feared that politics had to be grim and art had to be frivolous." This is something that you say in the beginning of the book, but you say, you talk about a book that offered you, at that time, a totally different perspective. David Sweetman's Explosive Acts, Toulouse-Lautrec, Oscar Wilde, Félix Mignon, and the art and anarchy of the fin de siècle. So if you could talk about that moment when you recognized or came to see the kind of almost emancipatory potential of art.
I had well, first of all, I don't know if the slideshow can work, but let's start that. Yeah, just keep clicking through it. Awesome.
Yes, very good.
All right, so you see that I can draw now. So I grew up obsessed with Toulouse-Lautrec. My mother introduced me to his work. For those who don't know, he was the chronicler of the Moulin Rouge in Paris at the turn of the century. And the thing that made his work different than all of the other artists that were obsessed with the Moulin Rouge, because everyone does love a can-can girl, is that he didn't just capture the sexiness and the smiles, he captured the class war that was going on those stages. This was a place where very poor people who fate would have assigned them a life of like scrubbing laundry till they died of TB at the age of 30, had, through talent and through grit and through daring and just through sheer charisma, staked a different future for themselves on the stage. And in that space, these people like La Goulou, the star can-can dancer, were pressed right up against the richest people in the world, like the Prince of Wales. And in that space, the Prince of Wales was not the one who was in charge, it was La Goulou. There's a moment that Toulouse-Lautrec captured where La Goulou is picking the hat off the Prince of Wales. Just this total gesture of like dominance, like I may be trash, I may have come from nothing, I may end up as nothing, but in here I'm queen and you are the nothing. So I grew up adoring that in Toulouse-Lautrec's art. I'm also about the same height as him, he was pretty tiny. And I also like to drink like him. And I always had this image that one day I would sit in the corner of some nightclub like him, and I would draw all those pretty girls with a glass of absinthe at my side, and I would have a place for myself there, right? I would earn it with my sketchbook. But I had, early on, not thought of that as a political thing. I merely thought of that as me wanting to hang out with girls that were too pretty for me to hang out with otherwise. And it was reading this book, Explosive Acts, that first sort of gelled in my mind that this isn't just, pretty girls wearing frilly skirts doing a cool dance, and this isn't just about my later obsession with the New York burlesque scene, which was also about pretty girls in frilly skirts doing cool dances. It's also that this space, this nightclub, is a space of defiance, of rebellion, and of transgression. It's a political space. And I wanted to capture that. And I was able to put this into practice 5 years after I found this book, which changed my view so much. And the way I was able to put it into practice was there was a New York nightclub that I think is closed now, that's called The Box. And The Box was a place where all of my friends from the New York burlesque scene, all the fire eaters, all of the dancers, all the acrobats, would be performing their most louche and depraved acts on stage, while the people who destroyed the world were in the audience blowing $10,000 pop on champagne. And it was also class war in the form of a nightclub. And I was obsessed with it. And one night, I got invited in by a friend who was performing. I took out my sketchbook, and the owner noticed me drawing. And I said, "Do you want me to be your Toulouse-Lautrec?" And it worked. And that was the first time that I've been able to use my sketchbook to make that bridge between the world of these beautiful girls that I worshiped because they were so beautiful and so cool and they sparkled like hard diamonds, and also this class critique.
Yeah, no, and you write about that in your memoir. It's extremely powerful. And explain, first of all, where did those sketches go, the ones you made at the box then, and then how your trajectory was shaped. You started in New York, but then you moved to London with the box, and explain how you got involved in the protests that broke out in London at the time.
I started out doing everything for the box, from body painting their waitstaff to massive theatrical backdrops. I convinced the owner to allow me to make their symbol, a pig snorting cocaine. I would have these like little tiny pigs, snorting coke, and then I would draw my dancer friends as goddesses towering over them. And these drawings that I did, they ended up on bottles, on condoms that the box gave out, on printed, 50 feet tall, all sorts of things. But for me, a turning point came when the box opened up their nightclub in Soho, and they brought me out to paint the place. This was about 2010. I, by this point, was getting very tired of just drawing my beautiful girls, even if I did have my pig snorting cocaine as well. I felt like I had eaten too much sugar, and that there was this whole other world, this world that was happening on the streets, that was happening in protest encampments and squats, that I also wanted to draw and to portray, but I didn't know how, because I felt so trapped in this visual language that I had created. So I go to London. I am painting these massive murals of pigs garbed as British fox hunters, riding the traditional symbols of England, hunting a man. And the man is forced up the nightclub stairs, past all of these goddesses and waitresses, and he emerges the other end as a pig to join the fox hunt. It was a circular thing. And at the same time, the student protests are exploding outside, and the police are bashing in the heads of students and kettling them in freezing cold. And students are fighting so hard just to have the right to reasonably priced education, something we obviously don't have in the US, but something they did have in England. And I was like, why aren't I with them for these? Why am I painting in Nero's nightclub? Why aren't I on the streets? And that question was what led me to immediately start chronicling Occupy Wall Street when next year it broke out about a block from where I lived.
Mm-hmm. And so talk about that moment, because initially you had said a feeling that you had was that before Occupy, you said, I felt like using my art for activist causes was exploitative of activist causes. So what happened once you got involved in, first of all, in London, drawing the student protesters, and then back in New York with Occupy? What did you see that your art, you were capable of doing with your art that was not, in fact, exploitative, quite the reverse?
I think initially it was more that these movements, they were open, right? Like anyone could come to Occupy, anyone could come to those protest encampments. I didn't feel like I was less than because I didn't have a college degree or because I, couldn't talk about Foucault or whatever. I felt like I was invited because everyone was invited, and because everyone was invited to help however they could, whether that was as a cook or whether that was as a medic. The way I could help was by drawing. That's my skill. If I was a carpenter, I would have done that. And I pretty immediately started going down to Occupy every day to chronicle the people that were there in defiance of real police brutality, who were fighting against financial corruption. I also turned my apartment into a press room. It's how I got to know journalists, and as we know, journalism is a social disease if you hang out with them enough and start doing it yourself. And I think it was the radical openness of Occupy that gave me permission to do art about politics.
And just describe the scene for people who don't know. I mean, what happened, what you saw, what happened at Zuccotti Park, because it was really, I don't know, it seemed quite unprecedented for the city for something to happen, something like that to happen in that location around Wall Street.
Oh, it was amazing. So, this was after the British student protests. It was also after the Arab Spring had broken out, after the after Ben Ali had been booted out of Tunisia, after I think it was even after Mubarak had been overthrown. It was after the mass protest movements against austerity in Greece and in Spain. And this Canadian publication named Adbusters, which really had no cred with anyone, but just had a very astute sense of timing and a very, very good knack for visuals, started putting out posters that were like, where is our Tahrir Square moment? And they called this mass protest against the financial corruption that had wrecked our economy at the time. And not that many people showed up, but I think a few thousand did, including the anarchist academic David Graeber and other anarchists. And they led this crowd that was just kind of milling around at first to Zuccotti Park, which is a little sort of public-private owned patch of concrete in downtown Manhattan. And in that park, they decided that they were going to stay. And not just that they were going to camp out there, but they were going to attempt to build almost a utopian society in this park with a free gourmet kitchen and a table full of rollies and an amazing library and places to sleep, childcare, lectures by academics from all over the world. There was people involved in other revolutions and uprisings would come and speak to us. And all of this was being done in complete defiance of the NYPD, who wanted nothing so much as to bash all our heads in and throw all of this in dump trucks. It's also being done in defiance of Mayor Bloomberg, who had the same opinion. And despite many contradictions, conflicts, ridiculousnesses, and drum circles that occurred in Zuccotti Park, it lasted for 3 months, and I think more than anything revitalized the prospects of the left in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a remarkable scene in Zuccotti Park. So, there were a lot of images of that protest that circulated on social media, which of course wasn't quite as enormous then as it is now, but nevertheless, photographs of the bigger it got, the more journalists showed up. So the place is, images of the place, photographic images of the place are well documented. But there's something that you did that was quite different in your drawings. So if you could say a little bit about the difference between what a photojournalist makes visible and what your drawings show in that particular case of Zuccotti Park.
A photojournalist, and bless them, they're the bravest people around. What they have in front of them is just what they have, what they were able to catch at that particular moment with someone's hair blowing over their face in that particular way. And if at that moment cameras weren't allowed, if at that moment the police had yanked someone and put them into a van, if at that moment the lighting wasn't good or they had taken a break to get some coffee, that image doesn't exist. What art can do, what drawing can do, is it can use other things to build a truthful image. It can use memories, right? It can use visuals from places that power doesn't want you to see. For instance, I was arrested at the first anniversary of Occupy, and I wasn't arrested in some glorious way. I was doing nothing brave. I think a cop just wanted someone who looked like they wouldn't be trouble to fill out an arrest quota and dragged me into the street and then arrested me for blocking traffic. But typically, when you're arrested, you can't take photos. But I was able to draw the inside of my cell or the inside of the police van from memory. I was able to pick out specific protesters that maybe symbolized for me something because they were veterans, because they were elderly people. And I was able to, draw them as icons. I also did a lot of posters for Zuccotti that were not journalistic at all. They were just, posters because I was involved with it. And I would do these posters in the morning. I would give a scan to some Occupy activists, and by the evening, people would be out in the street using them as protest signs. And to me, this is like better than any gallery because it's your work being so enmeshed in the world. And that's also something, typically a photojournalist wouldn't do.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is because you have a unique insight into the different forms of representation of contemporary events, because of course you're not just, as if there is such a thing as just, but you're not just a painter or a drawer, you're also a fantastic writer. So if you could say, and we'll get into the specific places that you've been and the events that you've covered apart from Occupy and the students' protests in London, what you see each form bringing to the rendition of an event. So your writing versus your drawing, and in your own work, how they work together. Like even in your New York Review of Books pieces, there's always text and then there are always these beautiful sketches throughout.
Well, what drawing does is that it creates something that you don't need to speak a specific language, right, to understand. Like my work, someone can, look at it just as much if they don't speak any English at all, right? And understand it just as well. It creates something that encapsulates so much history, so much emotion, so many individual lives into one specific image, and you can sort of read out from that. What drawing doesn't do is drawing can never be as specific as writing. If I have an image, it's just an image. And if it has no text with it, people can sort of get with it from it what they will. Like, they don't know, for instance, that I have an image that I really love that I did in Ukraine. It's of this sort of tank graveyard that's in front of the Mikhailovsky Cathedral in Kiev. And so it's all these these ruined Russian death machines that are there. And there are Ukrainian families go there and they take their kids and they all go and they kick them and they spit on them and they write, write mean graffiti on them and they take selfies on them. And then behind that, there is the Golden Dome Mikhailovsky, which is this fairy tale looking cathedral. It's so beautiful. It's pale blue with these those classic gold onion domes, and it's very fragile. And so these ugly, dirty death machines in front of this fragile, beautiful thing. And I drew a picture of that and the kids playing on it, and it's like death and life. And what you can't convey, right, in that is that the Mikhailovsky Cathedral, it's not an ancient, that building, it's not an ancient building because it was destroyed by the Soviets. And it was totally rebuilt in Ukraine after Ukraine got independence. I think in 1991, they started rebuilding it. And so the very existence of this cathedral itself there, it's not like it was this thing that was there forever uninterrupted. No, its existence is an act of self-assertion, right? And stubbornness. And reclaiming something that was destroyed. And for me to know that and to write that, it adds an entirely different layer that would have been impossible for anyone to get just from any picture.
So why don't we talk about that? How did you decide to go? You were in Ukraine, it was last summer, right? How did you decide to go, and how did you know what to do once you got there? Who did you meet? What did you decide to see?
I was in Eastern Europe already because I'm researching a book on the Jewish Labor Bund and my great-grandfather. And I was traveling around Latvia and Lithuania and Poland to places that were significant for the Bund and that were just significant Jewish places. And obviously, as I'm sure all of you know, to travel to these places as a Jewish person is intensely depressing. It's just really miserable because you're just seeing a litany of death and erasure. And I was going rather crazy, I would say, actually. And I had a friend who was a war correspondent who was in Kiev, and he invited me to come. And I'd wanted to go to Ukraine before, I'd wanted to cover it. I had an immense admiration for people's, defiance, their stubborn refusal to give up their homes. And I decided to go. By the time that my train arrived in Kiev, my war correspondent friend had long since ditched town, but I was lucky in that I had an introduction to this extraordinary Ukrainian woman, whose name I'm going to butcher, please forgive me, Anna, if you see this, Anna Greshchishkina. And she was a Guinness Book of World Records holding motorcyclist. She had spent 9 years circumnavigating the globe, the longest journey of any woman. And she was in Africa, in Zambia, I think, when the war broke out, and she immediately put her bike into storage, and she went back and she enlisted in a battalion. And she's a deputy commander now in a battalion in Ukraine. And when I got there, she was on leave, and we had a drink, and I was like, you were so tough and cool and brilliant, and I want to hang with you. And so she got me on the back of her friend's motorcycle and took me to DP camps. She took me to places like Bucha, which is notorious for the butchery that the Russian army did during the occupation. She took me to places where you could see like what would I call them, like DIY Molotov cocktail stations that were left on the side of the road, and where you could see the apartment buildings that were just pancaked. And I ended up staying much longer than I thought. I ended up spending time with Jewish Ukrainians. I had this one moment where there was this elderly Polish lady who was not Jewish, but she devoted her life to learning Yiddish music since her retirement, and she was even doing like illegal concerts in her apartment during COVID. And I saw her and her friends like resurrecting this, my people's music, right? Yiddish music in a city that had air raid sirens every few hours. It was an extraordinary time, and I just wanted to document daily life, under the weight of this invasion.
Yeah, and you write, actually, this the article, for those who want to read it, it's in the New York Review of Books from last year, Molly's piece. It's called In the Shadow of Invasion. And you can see the drawings that Molly was talking about, and also the account that you give, because as you mentioned earlier, you're writing this book on the Jewish labor bund, and the significance of this language, the loss of the language of Yiddish. You write in the piece, talking about this group that's trying to revive the language, you say, quote, "The sounds of this language, Yiddish, sung in a country where 80 years ago almost all of its speakers were murdered, was enough to bring tears to my eyes." So if you could speak about the kind of intimacy that you have with certain places that you cover, where you see your own subjectivity somehow represented in what's happening, and in this case it was actually very proximate, and how that impacts your, I don't know, what kind of effect that has on you and on the work that you produce.
I think it's different every place. Like many places, I don't have a familial connection with them. I'm just coming as someone who's trying my best to do justice to a place that I'm not as familiar with. But with Ukraine, or in a very different way with Palestine, I think I don't know. It's hard, right? Because if you're tied with something, it's so easy to mess it up, to fall into sentimental slop, right? To make a bunch of those cliches that I've talked so much about trying to avoid. And I think you're always examining yourself and trying to say, like, am I getting it right? But if you left that out, the fact that you were all mixed up in it, you would also be creating a lie.
So let's talk about the other place where you were much more recently, which is Palestine, where you were at another Festival of Literature, the Palestine Festival of Literature, where you spent time in the West Bank and in occupied East Jerusalem. The piece you wrote for the New York Review of Books, it's called "The Land Remains." So, if you could explain what were your observations while you were there, and the decisions that you made to paint. I mean, one image in particular in that piece is of Mariam Baghouti, the Palestinian journalist. If you could just say a little bit about your experience, and after that we will open it up to questions, so please start thinking of questions you'd like to ask Molly.
I spent, how long did I spend there? 3 weeks, I believe, in Palestine. At first as the guest of the Palestinian Festival of Literature, and then, quite honestly, hanging out with friends in Ramallah, and traveling and drawing. And what I was trying to get in my work was this contrast between this real architecture of cowardice that Israel has built, of walls and cages and checkpoints and barbed wire, versus this very vital life that Palestinians have made for themselves in defiance of this very literal apartheid. And the image that you're talking about of Mariam, I wish I had had a slide of that. I hadn't thought to make it, but so Mariam is an amazing Ramallah-based journalist who, you can't go anywhere with her because she'll be an hour late because she knows everyone on the street and she has to talk with them, and also she has to pick all the jasmine to and she has to hang with all the kids and pet the street cats, and before you know it, it's time is ruined with her. But I stayed with her, and she's very, very generous. She's always feeding you. She's always feeding you cigarettes. Buying plums off the street for you. She's young and brilliant. And there's this one morning where we had both sort of rolled out of bed after a night of drinking, and she had her hair kind of in a top knot, and she had this very long neck, and she looked kind of like a Degas ballerina, And she was making coffee in a traditional, in a Greek, traditional Arab coffee pot. And the light was just hitting the back of her neck, and I was so beautiful. And I had to draw it. And I wasn't thinking of it as a political statement. I was thinking, this is my beautiful friend, I want to draw her. But then when I did it, I was this is what is so seldom portrayed, which is the moments of beauty and of grace in Palestine, not just the moments of repression that's wielded against them, but also people's capacity for grace and for joy.
Okay, so now we can open the floor to questions. Please raise your hands, and your hand, not both of them, and someone will bring you a microphone. Questions for Molly? Yes, please.
Where's your next stop?
I'm sorry, 1 second. So I'll just point to the person so the person can get the microphone, and then this lady in the second row, please.
Sorry. Excuse me.
Thank you for your openness and everything. I'm just wondering, you've seen such horrific sights, and how does writing and painting kind of keep you separate from what you're actually seeing? Does it go outside of you? Does it help you that way? Or, as you indicated before, is this more of an expression of commentary on your part?
I think drawing especially does distance you from what you're drawing. I think that's a very astute observation, because no matter what you're drawing, whether it's the most miserable or most marvelous thing in the world, what you're doing when you draw is you're breaking it down into lines and angles and colors, and you're objectifying it in a quite literal sense, right? You're taking the world in front of you and making it an object in your sketch pad, and that does distance you, and it does, in many ways, I think, help you cope with what you're seeing in the moment, at least, if not later.
Sorry, gentlemen, you had a question, yes.
Hi. I enjoyed your perspectives in your travels.
I don't think his microphone is on.
I enjoyed your conversation and your perspectives as you travel. So I have two quick questions. One is,
Yeah, I think most artist journalists included are drawn by pathos and conflict, and a lot of your photographs reflect that, whether it's Ukraine or Palestine. Have you done work previously, or will that happen, where you capture something magical and happy? Some of that in the world as well. So that's the first question. And the second, where's your next stop?
Well, yeah, first question, yes. My current project is actually not about, it's not about war and conflict. My current project is I'm drawing my beloved friends, including Nermeen, sitting on my great-grandmother's chair looking fabulous. And some of my most cherished projects have also been about things that are not war. For instance, I love the acrobats that perform on New York City subways. I think that they're like the OG New York hustler artists. And one of my favorite projects that I did last year was I hung out with a 21-year-old kid named Sonny who does crazy stunts on the subways, backflips, all of that. He's been doing them since he was 13. And I just ran around with him all day, photographing him and doing pictures, just trying to capture this kid who's like Spider-Man meets Cirque du Soleil, And yes, I love to capture joy and magic. And I think the key to my own art is trying to capture both of those extremes of life, right? The beauty and the magic, and also the sometimes horror of it. My next stop, well, I'm actually in New York City for the next 10 months because I got a fellowship at the Cullman Center with the New York Public Library. And so my next stop is my office at the library, where I'm going to be immersed in crumbling Yiddish books.
That's a question. Yes, please.
Yeah, really wonderful to hear you. You often photograph people on the edge of distress. How do you get them to open up?
Well, one thing, it's different, right, with every person, but one thing that I remember was there was this Greek refugee camp on the island of Samos. It was really, really miserable place. And this lovely Syrian lady had taken me into the camp. I had met her like 5 minutes before, and she wanted to show journalists like how crap it was. And in the camp, I met this very, very like cool young Palestinian guy from Syria. And he told me, he's like, man, you journalists, you come into the camp, you've been doing it for a year, and what do? We tell you how miserable things are, you write it down, you write an article, you get paid for it, and we're still in the camp. Why should we talk to you? And I thought about it, and I told him, I was like, what you say is 100% correct. However, my article, it can't get you out of this camp, but it can ruin the afternoon, maybe, of the person who put you there. Would you like to ruin his afternoon? And he was like, I would indeed like to ruin his afternoon. And that's why he spoke to me. And I think just in general, just like being honest with, it's the same tools, I think, that you use to get people to open up with you as a journalist, you just use as a conversation partner, right? Like just being curious, being interested, not being, this is not how you deal with powerful people. Someone in a refugee camp, but just being like a curious, interested person. And I've had a lot of luck with people telling me things, including things probably they shouldn't have told me. Also, I think a lot of people who are going through these things, they want to talk. They want to tell other people, especially people with a platform, what has been done to them.
The gentleman here in the blue shirt.
Thank you very much for sharing with all of us your experiences. The question that I have is, as an artist, several have talked about your photos. Do you work from photos you take at the sites, or you work from memory? And the other question I had was, as an artist, do you, when it's done, or do you come back to some of these things, say 2 or 3 days after, it's like, oh, there's this nuance I want to add, and so you rework the drawing, or maybe you do different versions of the same drawing. or the same sketch, however you characterize it?
I have a few different methods of working. Often, this person remembered this checkpoint there. What kind of chairs did people use at that checkpoint? What kind of, sort of scrubby vegetation would be in the background? I try as much as possible to get it to be real, and it's a lot of research sometimes, and sometimes a lot of interviews if I'm working with someone else. In terms of returning to things, in general, I try to be like, it's done, but a lot of times it just torments me. I think I've gotten something wrong, and I will definitely mess with it later, and a few times I have totally redone things because I thought I had just done such a poor job of capturing something, and I could not let it sit like that.
I think we have time for one more question. The gentleman at the back in the black shirt.
Hello, Molly. Nice to meet you. Thank you for sharing your story. So the question I have is, as somebody who paints across, do you always have that conscious thought that you have to exaggerate an image to basically speak the reality? And do you always have to think, like, do you ever go back and think, oh, this probably is not what happened? Does it ever happen? Do you have the conscious thought that, am I straying away from what exactly happened and putting too much of yourself into that image? How do you balance what actually happened, what you saw, and what actually just came out of it?
Well, I sometimes try, in fact, the opposite of exaggerating. For instance, in a lot of my pieces from Syria, I use a limited color palette. So I used like only grays, or when I was doing the stuff from Raqqa, based on my collaborator Marwan Hisham's photos, I would use only black and yellow to simplify it, so that you could focus on what was going on. But I think it's just, if you're working journalistically, right? You make sure that you're not putting in nonsense. If I was doing something else, for instance, when I was at the Republican National Convention, where Mr. Trump got nominated in 2016, I did a number of images that, for instance, of him as like a multi-headed sort of Hydra figure, or him crowning himself in a beauty pageant while the other Republican supplicants looked on, that I feel comfortable everyone knows that he doesn't have several heads, and he wasn't really wearing that G-string and sash. It really was. It's pretty bad. So I think it's just being clear about what you're working in. But if I'm working journalistically, I take huge pains to make sure that what's in that drawing is what happened.
I think that we're through with time, so thank you so much, Molly.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Nermeen, for that fascinating conversation. Yes, please, let's give them another round of applause.